The International Monetary Fund's stranglehold on African economies is experiencing unprecedented fractures, and the architects of this financial imperialism are witnessing their carefully constructed empire collapse before their very eyes. What we're observing across the continent isn't merely economic turbulence. It's the systematic dismantling of a neocolonial apparatus that has held African nations in perpetual subjugation for over 6 decades. The tremors began in Burkina Faso, where Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't simply reject another predatory loan package. He fundamentally challenged the philosophical foundations of Western financial hegemony. When Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would prioritize food sovereignty over debt servicing, he wasn't making an isolated policy decision. He was articulating a revolutionary principle that African nations possess the inherent right to determine their economic priorities without external validation or permission. This paradigm shift represents something far more profound than conventional anti-establishment rhetoric. We're witnessing the emergence of authentic African economic nationalism, rooted in the understanding that true sovereignty requires complete financial independence. The IMF's traditional playbook, structural adjustment programs, austerity measures, resource extraction facilitation, is encountering systematic resistance from leaders who refuse to perpetuate the economic violence inflicted upon their populations. Consider the strategic brilliance of Mali's recent maneuvers under Colonel Assimi Goita. Rather than capitulating to IMF demands for mining sector liberalization, Mali has begun renegotiating resource contracts with China and Russia, fundamentally altering the geopolitical calculus. This isn't opportunistic alliance shifting. It's sophisticated economic statecraft that prioritizes national interest over donor dependency. The Western financial establishment's panic is palpable and entirely justified. For decades, the IMF operated as the primary mechanism through which Western powers maintained economic control over African resources without the administrative burden of direct colonial governance. Through carefully crafted loan conditions, structural adjustment programs, and debt restructuring agreements, the fund ensured that African economies remained oriented toward resource extraction and export-dependent growth models that benefited metropolitan centers rather than local populations. This system functioned with ruthless efficiency precisely because it co-opted African political elites into compliance. The IMF didn't need to impose policies through military force when local leaders could be incentivized to implement the same extractive frameworks voluntarily. The genius of neocolonial control lay in its ability to make exploitation appear consensual, even inevitable. But the current generation of African leaders represents a fundamental departure from this collaborative subjugation. These aren't the compromised figures who built careers managing decline. They're strategic thinkers who understand that authentic development requires breaking free from externally imposed economic structures entirely. The ripple effects extend far beyond individual policy decisions. Niger's post-coup leadership has systematically expelled French military bases while simultaneously reviewing uranium contracts that have undervalued Nigerian resources for decades. These aren't isolated actions. They represent comprehensive sovereignty strategies that address military, economic, and resource dimensions simultaneously. Guinea's Colonel Mamady Doumbouya has initiated similar comprehensive reviews of bauxite mining agreements, recognizing that aluminum production should benefit Guinean workers rather than exclusively serving international commodity markets. The pattern is unmistakable. African leaders are finally treating their natural resources as strategic assets rather than colonial inheritances to be liquidated for foreign benefit. The IMF's response has been characteristically tone-deaf and reveals the institution's fundamental inability to adapt to changing African realities. Rather than acknowledging the legitimate grievances driving this continental resistance, fund officials have doubled down on condescending rhetoric about macroeconomic stability and international best practices, language that barely conceals the underlying assumption that African nations lack the competence to manage their own economic affairs. This paternalistic discourse isn't accidental. It's the ideological foundation upon which the entire neocolonial system rests. The IMF's authority, depends on maintaining the fiction that African economies require external management to function effectively. Acknowledging African economic competence would undermine the institution's fundamental reason for existence. The broader implications extend throughout the global financial architecture. The World Bank, European Investment Bank, and various bilateral development agencies all operate on similar assumptions about African economic incapacity. When African leaders demonstrate sophisticated understanding of monetary policy, resource management, and international trade, they're exposing the intellectual bankruptcy of institutions that have built their credibility on African subjugation. The youth demographic across Africa has proven particularly receptive to sovereignty messaging, understanding intuitively that their futures depend on breaking free from inherited economic constraints. Young Africans who have witnessed decades of IMF-prescribed policies failing to deliver meaningful development are naturally skeptical of institutions that promise transformation while perpetuating underdevelopment. This generational shift represents perhaps the most significant threat to neocolonial continuity. Previous generations often accepted the premise that African economies needed external guidance to achieve stability. Today's youth reject that assumption entirely, demanding leaders who prioritize national development over international approval. The technological revolution has also fundamentally altered information dynamics. African populations now have direct access to economic data, policy analysis, and comparative development metrics that were previously filtered through Western media outlets. When young Africans can independently verify that resource-rich nations remain impoverished despite decades of IMF guidance, the institution's credibility evaporates rapidly. Social media platforms have enabled pan-African conversations about economic sovereignty that transcend colonial linguistic and geographical divisions. Young Africans in Senegal can directly engage with counterparts in Kenya about development strategies, creating intellectual networks that bypass traditional academic and policy institutions entirely. This information democratization has exposed the fundamental contradictions in IMF messaging. The fund simultaneously claims to promote African development while implementing policies that maintain African economies in subordinate positions within global value chains. These contradictions become impossible to ignore when African populations have independent access to economic analysis and comparative data. The financial implications of African resistance extend far beyond the continent's borders. Western financial institutions have structured enormous portions of their portfolios around continued African resource extraction and debt servicing. When African nations begin prioritizing domestic development over export optimization, the entire global commodity trading system experiences destabilization. European industrial competitiveness has depended heavily on accessing African raw materials at below-market prices through IMF-facilitated extraction agreements. As African nations begin demanding fair compensation for their resources, European manufacturing costs increase dramatically, potentially triggering broader economic adjustments across Atlantic economies. The strategic partnerships emerging between African nations and alternative development partners represent sophisticated economic diplomacy rather than simple alliance switching. When Burkina Faso engages with Chinese agricultural technology firms or Russian mining equipment suppliers, these aren't ideological choices. They're pragmatic decisions based on which partnerships offer more favorable terms for African development. The Belt and Road Initiative's appeal to African leaders lies not in its ideological framework, but in its willingness to finance infrastructure projects without imposing governance conditions that compromise sovereignty. Chinese development loans typically focus on tangible infrastructure outcomes rather than structural adjustment requirements that reshape entire economic systems. Russian partnerships often emphasize security cooperation and resource development agreements that allow African nations to retain greater control over extraction processes. These partnerships aren't necessarily superior to Western alternatives, but they offer African leaders more negotiating leverage and policy flexibility. The Pan-African cooperation dimension deserves particular emphasis because it represents the most sustainable foundation for continental economic independence. The African Continental Free Trade Area creates opportunities for intra-African commerce that reduces dependence on external markets and financing mechanisms. When African nations begin trading primarily with each other using continental payment systems, the IMF's role as financial intermediary becomes increasingly obsolete. Regional development banks, continental investment funds, and bilateral trade agreements create alternative financial architectures that bypass traditional Western institutions entirely. The African Development Bank has begun assuming greater prominence in continental development financing, offering development models that prioritize African priorities over donor preferences. While the institution isn't perfect, it represents a significant step toward financial independence from Western-dominated multilateral organizations. Regional economic communities across Africa have also intensified integration efforts, recognizing that continental unity provides the scale necessary to resist external economic pressure. The Economic Community of West African States, East African Community, and Southern African Development Community are all exploring deeper integration mechanisms that reduce vulnerability to external economic manipulation. Currency sovereignty represents another crucial dimension of this broader independence movement. Several African nations have begun exploring digital currency systems, regional payment mechanisms, and reduced dependence on dollar-denominated international transactions. The CFA franc system, which has maintained French monetary control over 14 African nations for decades, faces unprecedented scrutiny as populations recognize how currency dependence perpetuates economic subordination. Leaders who challenge these arrangements aren't engaging in reckless monetary experimentation. They're addressing fundamental sovereignty deficits that have constrained African development for generations. The media dimension of this struggle cannot be underestimated. Western media outlets consistently frame African sovereignty movements as destabilizing, chaotic, or authoritarian, rarely acknowledging the legitimate grievances driving continental resistance to neocolonial institutions. This media bias isn't accidental. It serves to delegitimize African agency while maintaining the fiction that Western institutions represent stability and rationality. When African leaders are consistently portrayed as irrational or dangerous for asserting sovereignty, it becomes easier to justify continued external intervention in African affairs. The contrast with media coverage of Ukrainian sovereignty, European economic nationalism, or American protectionism is particularly revealing. When Western nations assert economic independence or reject unfavorable international agreements, such actions are framed as legitimate expressions of national interest. When African nations pursue identical policies, they are characterized as threats to international stability. This double standard exposes the fundamentally racist assumptions underlying much Western policy discourse about Africa. African economic nationalism is treated as inherently dangerous, while European or American economic nationalism is presented as rational policy making. The intellectual tradition supporting African economic sovereignty draws from decades of pan-African thought, from Kwame Nkrumah's neocolonialism analysis to Thomas Sankara's self-reliance philosophy. Contemporary leaders like Ibrahim Traoré aren't inventing new political theories. They're implementing long-established African intellectual frameworks that previous generations were unable to fully actualize. This historical continuity demonstrates that current sovereignty movements represent authentic African political development rather than external manipulation or opportunistic power grabbing. The ideas driving contemporary resistance have deep roots in African political thought and have been refined through decades of practical experience with neo-colonial exploitation. The economic analysis supporting African independence is also increasingly sophisticated. African economists, policy analysts, and development theorists have produced extensive research demonstrating the failures of IMF-prescribed development models and outlining alternative approaches that prioritize domestic capacity building over export optimization. This intellectual foundation provides contemporary sovereignty movements with credible policy frameworks that extend beyond simple rejection of Western influence. African leaders can articulate comprehensive development strategies that offer realistic alternatives to donor dependency and structural adjustment. The generational dimension extends beyond simple demographic change. Young African leaders have educational backgrounds, technological familiarity, and international experience that enable them to engage with global economic systems as equals rather than supplicants. They understand both traditional African governance principles and contemporary policy challenges, creating unique synthesis approaches that draw from multiple intellectual traditions. These leaders also benefit from observing the failures of previous approaches to African development. They've witnessed firsthand how compromise with neocolonial institutions produces limited results and often perpetuates the very problems such compromises were intended to address. This strategic patience displayed by contemporary African sovereignty movements reflects sophisticated political analysis rather than impulsive policy making. Leaders understand that genuine independence requires systematic capacity building, institutional development, and alternative partnership cultivation that cannot be accomplished overnight. This measured approach distinguishes contemporary sovereignty movements from previous liberation efforts that sometimes underestimated the complexity of post-independence state building. Current leaders are implementing comprehensive strategies that address military, economic, social, and cultural dimensions of independence simultaneously. The regional coordination occurring across Africa also reflects lessons learned from earlier independence movements that were often isolated and vulnerable to external manipulation. Contemporary Pan-African cooperation creates mutual support networks that make individual nations less susceptible to economic coercion or military intervention. The implications for global economic governance extend far beyond Africa's borders. If African nations successfully establish alternative development models that prioritize sovereignty over donor approval, other developing regions may pursue similar strategies. The IMF's authority depends on maintaining universal acceptance of its development prescriptions. Successful African alternatives could trigger broader legitimacy crises for Western-dominated international institutions. The demographic realities supporting African sovereignty movements also suggest long-term sustainability. Africa's population is young, growing, and increasingly connected to global information networks. These populations won't accept the economic marginalization that previous generations often endured as inevitable. The technological capabilities available to contemporary African leaders also provide unprecedented opportunities for independent development. Digital payment systems, renewable energy technologies, and information communication networks enable development strategies that bypass traditional infrastructure dependencies. African nations can potentially leapfrog developmental stages that historically required extensive external financing or technical assistance. When development strategies utilize technologies that reduce dependence on external inputs, sovereignty movements become more sustainable and resistant to economic pressure. The resource endowments that have historically made African nations targets for exploitation are increasingly being reconceptualized as foundations for independent development. Rather than viewing mineral wealth, agricultural potential, and renewable energy capacity as resources to be exported, African leaders are exploring value-added processing, domestic utilization, and regional integration strategies. This philosophical shift from resource extraction to resource utilization represents perhaps the most fundamental challenge to neocolonial economic structures. When African nations begin consuming and processing their own resources rather than exporting raw materials, the entire global commodity system requires restructuring. The environmental dimensions of this transition also align with global sustainability imperatives. African-controlled development strategies often prioritize renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and ecological preservation in ways that externally imposed development models typically ignore. Contemporary African sovereignty movements represent the culmination of decades of intellectual development, practical experience, and generational change. They draw from authentic African political traditions while engaging sophisticatedly with contemporary global challenges. The IMF's African empire isn't simply crumbling. It's being systematically dismantled by leaders who understand that genuine development requires complete independence from neocolonial financial institutions. This isn't chaos or instability. It's the natural progression of African political maturity. The future belongs to nations that prioritize sovereignty over submission, development over dependency, and African agency over external validation. The tremors we're witnessing today will become the earthquakes that reshape global economic governance tomorrow. If you believe in African sovereignty and want to support this movement toward genuine independence, show your solidarity by engaging with this content. Like this video to boost its visibility in the algorithm and ensure more people hear these crucial perspectives. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our analysis of African political developments. Share this video across your social media platforms because mainstream media won't amplify these voices. Your engagement directly supports the African sovereignty movement by ensuring our message reaches audiences hungry for authentic analysis. Every like, comment, and share represents a vote for African agency and self-determination. The revolution is being live-streamed, and your participation matters. Together, we are documenting the collapse of neocolonial institutions and celebrating the emergence of truly independent African nations. Subscribe now and join this historic moment in African liberation.